I'm Mark Sleboda, and this is The Real Politik. The West-backed Kiev Putsch regime has spent the last few months building up an enormous new army. It claims 1 million men strong, though it's probably about half that, and nearly all of it with no military experience and next to no training. But it has been said that in military matters, quantity has a quality all of its own. It has built up this massive amount of cannon fodder by a policy of mass forced conscription, though it's never called such in the Western mainstream media, instead referred to obliquely as mobilization. Albeit a mobilization that has seen the regime forbid its own male citizens from 16 to 60 years of age from even leaving the country, and regularly sending its brown shirts to raid nightclubs, cafes, and beaches looking for more cannon fodder. Meanwhile, the Russian intervention force has up till now been self-limited by the legalistic terms of the special military operation to just some 150,000 Russian troops, supplemented by some 40 to 50,000 former Ukrainian militia from the Donbass, who have been fighting to free themselves for some 8 long years now. This is only around 10% of Russia's actual million-man strong active duty military, much less its 2 million available reserves, or its 25 million total pool of fighting age men with previous military service and experience. Under the direction of Pentagon planning and wargaming, the Kiev regime came up with a strategy to put this relative manpower advantage to good use, namely a counteroffensive attacking everywhere at once, across multiple axes and with broad fronts, with what amounts in large part to fast-moving human wave attacks, exhausting Russian aviation, rocket systems, and artillery, trying to protect undermanned defensive lines everywhere at once, while continuing the primary offensive in Donetsk at the same time. This Kiev/Washington strategy was a complete failure in the south of Ukraine, in Kherson, where Russia has built up defenses and amassed fires and mobile reserves, leading to horrible casualties among the Kiev regime's forces and minimal gains. But just the threat of it outmaneuvered the Russian military in the lightly garrisoned north of the Kharkov region, forcing them to decide to sacrifice the north, and withdraw with almost no fighting to avoid being enveloped and overrun, handing Kiev a major territorial and propaganda victory. The Kiev regime forces for this counteroffensive strategy were largely armed by the flood of Western military aid, the sizable gear that the Kiev regime started this conflict with almost being completely wiped out at this point, leading to the situation where the self-limited Russian intervention force was in effect fighting all of NATO's collective military might and technology. It is just conscripted Ukrainian proxies doing the dying. Now, the Kremlin has finally responded by doing what many Russian politicians and military analysts, including myself, have long called for, since the beginning, really, calling up some 300,000 of its 2 million rostered reserves, which has been referred to as a partial mobilization. All of these rostered reserves, however, unlike the Kiev regime's mass forced conscription, are recent military veterans, having completed their active duty status in the last 10 years, all having combat experience, and all of them still regularly being required to show up several times a year for practice and drills as reserves. Now, this calling up of Russian reserves has been greeted with outrage by Western governments and attacked by the Western mainstream media and commentariat in a furious Infowar onslaught. It has been dismissed and lambasted as a desperate sign of Russian military weakness. That a small number of those called up refused to serve and fled the country, and that small protests against the call up occurred, was exaggerated ridiculously and out of all proportion. The Western media and commentariat, with their 5-minute memories, seem to forget that when the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq and Afghanistan in recent undeclared foreign wars, that the U.S. military reserves were also called up, and in fact, nearly half of all U.S. troops eventually deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan were reserves or National Guard, more than 300,000 total deployments of them. They also forget that at least some 5,500 U.S. troops refused to fight and deserted initially, many fleeing the country to Canada or Europe for asylum, and that total U.S. desertion for the two conflicts reached at least 20,000, nearly an 80% increase. And they conveniently forget that millions of Americans across the country protested in the streets against the invasion of Iraq. The sheer hypocrisy in the two narratives for the Russian military now calling up its reserves is staggering. But it's different when we do it, right? Well, there is a saying in Russia: the dog barks, but the caravan passes on. The West is scared. This will solve the Russian intervention forces' manpower shortage in Ukraine and be a true game changer. And they know it. Let the West bark on impotently.